Hello and welcome to Attack of the Famiclones HD. Welcome to part 4 of my look at the Super Retro Trio. If you missed the previous parts, click the annotations right here to go check out those videos. Part 1 was the overview, Part 2 talked about the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, Part 3 was the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, and now you're at Part 4. There will also be a 5th part, which I will do a final thoughts on the system, so stay tuned. Okay, in this section I'm going to be talking about the NES portion of the Super Retro Trio. Now, it seems like whenever there is a clone system, there's always an Achilles heel, and unfortunately with the Super Retro Trio, it is the NES section. Now, I've been fairly positive on the Super Retro Trio thus far with the excellent Genesis and absolutely fantastic Super Nintendo portions of the system, but the NES slot is where things start to take a dive. It's not the worst clone NOAC system I've come across, but it's definitely not the best. But before I get into too many negatives, let's talk about some of its positives and give some basic information. So the system that's included here is the NES portion. It will not play Famicom games natively, but you can use a NES to Famicom adapter that allows you to simply plug in your Famicom games on top, and that will allow you to play your Japanese games. European games, however, are hit and miss because this system is NTSC, just like the Super Nintendo, and the Genesis is multi-region, so that doesn't matter, but the Super Nintendo and NES ports are NTSC only. This means that if you have your European games, they will run, but they won't run at the right speed, and that's because the European NES runs at 1.66 megahertz, whereas the NTSC, North American, and the Japanese versions run at 1.79 megahertz. That's a 17% difference, and what that translates to is basically everything in the game, from the gameplay to the music, will run 17% faster than it should if you try and run PAL games on the system. Likewise, if you try and run NTSC games on a PAL system, they'd run 17% slower than they should. So because of this, if you live in Europe, and you want to play NES games, if you have this thing, if you want to get this thing, you're gonna have to import NTSC games. European games probably going to drive you nuts if you try and play them. And again, because they'll be 1.7 times faster than they should, or 17% faster. As well, the system has a lot of controller ports, as I mentioned in previous parts. It has the 2 Genesis ports, the 2 Super Nintendo ports, and the 2 NES ports. Now, you can, of course, use NES controllers when you're using the Super Retro Trio's NES port, but you can also use Sega Genesis controllers, and that's because the system uses Sega Genesis as a native format for all of its games. So this means that you can use a standalone OEM regular original Sega Genesis controller. If you use a Sega Genesis controller to play your games, you have the B and A buttons mapped to the A and B buttons, which is a little bit confusing, but it makes sense if you think about it. Or you can use the Super Nintendo looking controllers that are also Genesis controllers, or you can use, of course, your NES controllers. What you cannot use are Super Nintendo controllers, at least not natively. Now, I do make adapters, so if you're interested, you can contact me. I make adapters that allow you to use OEM or whatever clone or whatever Super Nintendo controllers on your NES or NES clones. So you can do that if you're interested. Also, I should mention that because the system is a modern clone, it has your standard composite jacks, but allows you to have stereo and mono through the NES. The NES was not a stereo system, but it allows for dual mono, so you have mono channels on both the left and right channels. It also has S-Video pass-through, but what you're getting here is not actually true S-Video, and that's because the NES is not capable of S-Video, and especially not NES clones. These ones, they're capable of RF and composite, and that's all they can do. So what Retrobit did with the Super Retro Trio is just like what they did with the Retro Duo, whereas when you try and run S-Video through the NES section, what you're getting is actually composite video that's passing through the luminescence line of the S-Video. And what this results in is sort of like a checkerboard dithering effect. It's not, super fantastic to look at. So if you're using it, you probably want to just unplug S-Video and just use straight composite, because your video feed will be far better. With all that said, now let's get into the negatives. This NOAC is not as good as some of the NOACs that have come out, especially from Retrobit. It's not even as good as Retrobit's RetroGen adapter, or I'm sorry, the Gen X clone, which I reviewed in the previous video. That NOAC is really quite good in a lot of aspects. It does require some bit of modding to really tweak it, but what NOAC doesn't. It also has support for Famicom expansion audio if you have a proper adapter that's been modified to support the Famicom expansion channels. That NOAC will actually work with that, and that board will work with that. This one does not, so that's first and foremost. Second of all, the composite video that you get out of this is not that great. It's about the same as the standalone retro port, which I've reviewed previously. In addition to that, there are a bunch of mods that I've had to do in order to get the system to be anywhere near tolerable for my standards anyway. For one thing, is the video. The video signal is quite dark natively through composite. It's fine if you want to use S-Video, but again, you have to go through that checkerboard-ish effect, which I'll show you guys. Yeah, so in order to fix that, you need to find a resistor. I think it's R83, it's labeled right on the board. And you remove it and bridge the connection with solder. It's very simple to do that. All you need to do is just heat up your soldering iron and then press it against the surface mount resistor until it heats up and it literally just comes off. And then just take a little bit of solder and bridge the two connections together. I'll show you guys in the description below in an image on what you need to click on in order to get this going. As well, just like a lot of other NOACs, this one does not work with MMC4 or MMC5 games. So that means no games like Famicom Wars or Castlevania 3. Those games do not work on this NOAC. However, there is another fix for that, and I have to credit my good friend Ace9921 because he's just a genius at this kind of thing. So he determined that you can actually use a little chip like this. This is a hex inverter. This is, in fact, a 74HC04 hex inverter. Now, if you solder this in place, I'll again put in the description below an image on what you need to do in order to get this working. You can get Castlevania 3 running if you install this little chip inside the RetroGen, or the Super Retro Trio. Now, with all that said, let's get into the stress testing of this thing. Because my system is now modded, it will work with Castlevania 3, but keep in mind, again, it will not do it natively. Also, the final, really, I don't know how big of a problem this is. It occurs with mine. My system has a bad APU, which is the audio processor. The audio processor that's embedded into the NOAC of this clone does not produce reverse duty cycles or anything like that, but what it does do is produce false notes. So you're getting music that is incorrect. But this only occurs in very select games, and it doesn't occur in the vast majority of the games. And also, it's unknown how many of the Super Retro Trios this actually affects. I've seen other people's videos that's already been posted online, and people have not had this problem, where it does occur in my system. I even know people who have gotten their Super Retro Trio, and then it had a certain problem with it, and had it sent back, and got a replacement, and the replacement had the issue that their original one didn't. So it's unknown exactly how many of these systems it affects. I just know it affects mine. So you'll be seeing that in this video. So Retrobit, you really got to work, I guess, on quality control here. But again, because it only affects a very small number of systems, or very small number of games, it's possible it just was, just got under the radar, and they never noticed it. So with all that said, let's get into the stress testing. Oh yeah, one more thing I should mention before I get into that is because of the orientation of the controller ports being on a horizontal plane, and they're not directly aligned next to each other because there's basically no room in the control panel for that, you can't use certain NES accessories such as the NES 4-score. The NES 4-score came with a plug that looked like this. The plug is vertical, and it's all made of like this hard plastic. So there's no way to interface this with the Super Retro Trio unless you use two extension cords. And I guess you could do that, but it's not really a huge loss because this was just the 4-player adapter and also had like turbo function built in into it. A cool device, but if you're going to be using the Super Retro Trio, you won't be able to use it. Alright, with all that said, let's play some games. So the first game, of course, is Super Mario Brothers. I'm going to be playing this with my TV muted, and the reason I'm going to be doing that is because Nintendo loves to throw up false copyright claims on any video that uses their music. So let's have it muted, and let's stick it to Nintendo. Okay, now let's hit power. Well, first things first, grab your NES controller. Plug it in. There we go. Turn it on, and there we go. Now the first thing you guys will see here is this is Super Mario Brothers running on the Super Retro Trio. But what it's doing here is it's running through S-Video. So you see that weird dithering effect? That's caused by the S-Video line. Excuse me. So the moment I unplug, goes back to composite. But that's boring to watch. So let's switch a game and let's continue on. Of course, there has to be a difficult game. There we go. Now what you're seeing here is Rockman 2 Endless. Now here's an underrated game. Alright, next let's try out some unlicensed games. First up, Tengen. America. Oops. There we go. Wisdom Tree. Alright, that game sucks. Retro Zone Homebrew. active enterprises.
Make your selection now.
Alright, enough of that. Alright. Next, classic gem. Alright, next is a game that demonstrates what the bad APU can do. So here's Castlevania 2. Next. There we go. Next, I'm showing Paperboy, because although Paperboy appears to work, it actually doesn't. The game does not respond to any controller input. The game just does whatever it wants on its own. Alright. Next, I'm using this solely as an example of DCPM, the sample channel of the NES. Here's another common problematic game, Ride Racer 2. Now, if you guys aren't, make sure you watch this with annotations turned on, because the annotations will explain some of these quirks here and tell you a bit about the games. Next. Chrysalis is a good example of a game that does not sound good on this clone, and that's because of the bad APU. Again, not all of the retro gens, or all the super retro trios will produce this bad sound. A lot of them might in fact just be normal. It might just be that I have a bad system. But I gotta show you what I got. Next, people will ask about this, so I'll show it. There's the NES Power Pack, and that's all it does. It does not actually work on the Super Retro Trio. Not surprised, because the Power Pack does not work on most Famiclones. However, if you use an adapter, a Famicom to NES adapter, the Famicom N8 does work, so I can play, you know, anything. I don't know. Let's boot. I don't know. Jaws. Yeah, Jaws. Must get the conch shell. Must get the shell. Alright, enough of that. But while I have this here, here is Akumajo Densetsu, the Japanese version of Castlevania 3, running on the running through a converter. So what you're hearing here is it not only hitting the bad notes, you know, the false notes of the bad APU, but it also does not produce the expansion audio. With that said, the game is still, you know, completely playable. But lastly, let's get the one that, you know, people will always be asking about, and that is the North American version of the same game. So this is what you get on my system if you try and run Castlevania 3. Now keep in mind again that Castlevania 3 will not run on an unmodded Super Retro Trio. You need to install the hex inverter for you to be able to play this. Installing the hex inverter is not really all that complicated. Again, check the video description down below for the link to see what to do here. It does take a bit of soldering, but it's not super bad. Just 4 wires, that's it. On an unmodded system, this game will not run at all, so keep that in mind. The game would completely crash about right here. Well, that'll about do it for this video. So I wanted to give you guys a gauntlet of games to test on the system, and so stay tuned for part 5 of my look at the Super Retro Trio for my final thoughts, and talk about what this future of the system is and what more you can do to further improve it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time for part 5.